welcome everybody to the final lecture by Professor Sanderson on the Tantrāloka. Well, the final lecture for us for this term.
I'm not moribund.
No.
Quite.
And, so he'll be concluding his discussion of the opening verses of the Tantrāloka. So Alexis, over to you.
Thank you. Well, last week we read the 13th of the introductory verses, in which Abhinavagupta acknowledges his debt to Shambhunatha, his guru Shambhunatha, and that guru's consort Bhagavati, his female consort Bhagavati. And I presented evidence that this lineage going back through Shambhunatha derives from the Deccan. It's not an indigenous Kashmirian lineage, which is a useful reminder of the error of assuming that because most texts arise from a certain region, they all arise from that region, that somehow you've regionalized the tradition and you can talk about Kashmir Śaivism as though it were a self-contained element. In my view, as you probably know, to refer to the Shaivism of Kashmir as Kashmir Śaivism is about as illusory, is about as wrong as to refer to Catholicism as Polish Catholicism, just because there are many Catholics in Poland, and no doubt there have been some distinguished Polish theologians. It doesn't become thereby a Polish phenomenon. So likewise here. So we had this lineage, an unnamed guru presiding in the Dakshina Pita, or the Dakshina Bhumi Pita, which I didn't have time to go into, but actually identify in all probability with Kolhapur, Kolagiri as it was called in earlier times, which is in the far south of Maharashtra, quite close to the border of the modern state of Karnataka, and for centuries has been a major center of goddess worship. That's where the temple of Lakshmi is located. That's a pretty tame enterprise these days. It's very smartized, detantricized in its character. But we know from earlier times it was a much more typical Śākta Pita in earlier centuries, with a specialization in devotional self-mutilation, among other things. A king tried to avoid a plague by chopping off one of his fingers and giving it to the goddess. We have inscriptional evidence of this. It's recorded by the king himself. I don't know whether it worked. I do hope so. So we have this tradition coming in from the Deccan, or rather we should say we don't have evidence that the Trika came in from the Deccan from that alone. We have other evidence which suggests that. But now, this week, I want to end my treatment of the 13th verse by asking the question, what do we know about the Trika in Kashmir before Abhinavagupta, which is our main source of knowledge of the Trika in Kashmir? Now, Abhinavagupta's dates are not established beyond doubt, but we have some dates for some of his works, and they stretch from the 990s through to 1015. So we can say he's roughly around 1000 AD. It's the center of his life's work. So how much before that can we take the Trika as present in Kashmir? And my answer is that we can take it back to the first quarter of the 9th century, which is virtually 2 centuries earlier than the detailed evidence we have from Tantrāloka. Now, there are no learned Śaiva texts surviving from Kashmir from that period. The earliest works we have are works like the Spaldikarika and Shiva Sutras and commentaries on those, which really perhaps emerged in the 9th century, but the exegesis is subsequent and roughly contemporary with Abhinavagupta. We know also that the Krama, the system of Kali worship, esoteric Kali worship, was present, it was growing in the region, again from the middle of the 9th century, beyond, after the Karkota dynasty in Kashmir. There was a kind of upsurge of Śaiva esotericism in the valley, which brought to the fore the Spaldikarika, the Shiva Sutras, and the Krama. But no evidence of the Trika at that stage. If you look at the Spaldikarika and the Shiva Sutras, there's nothing there which reveals beyond doubt that the redactor of that text was aware of the Trika as a system of ritual, with a particular pantheon, particular mantras, particular mandalas, for example, which and it's those sort of things which are the signature of a tradition. There's no point talking about, oh, well, there's traces of non-dualism or whatever. That's not enough. You need concrete evidence of knowledge of specific mantras, specific mandalas, and if you have that, you can also look for other things, esoteric information, which is a signature of a particular tradition. You can look for signs of that. So where have I found this very early evidence, relatively early evidence of the Trika? Well, it's in the Haravijaya. The Haravijaya Mahakavya. It really deserves the title Mahakavya. It's the longest of our surviving kavyas. It's 5,500 verses approximately, which is actually a massive accomplishment, because each of these verses is a Himalaya to climb. I mean, they're not easy. They're very complex and subtle compositions, and you've got 5,000 of them, all relating a mythological event, namely the slaying and liberation thereby of the Titan. Some people would say demon, that's incorrect. Titan, Andaka, one of the asuras that was killed in the Shaiva mythology. In this case by Chandi, the goddess Chandi, the ferocious goddess Chandi. She finally skews him on her trident. He is consumed, his blood boils on the trident, and he's finally reduced to ashes. And then a light emerges from the ashes and is seen by the amazed onlookers merging into the body of the goddess. And this trope of liberation through absorption of light from the ashes into the heart of the deity, which clearly symbolizes liberation, is actually drawn by Ratnakara from Magha, the great 7th century poet Magha, who ends his Shishupala Vada in exactly the same way. The final verse is being reflected by Ratnakara, in fact, in his Haravijaya. Again, the same motif of the slaying of Shishupala and the exiting of his spiritual essence in the form of a light, a bright light, and disappearing into the body of Vishnu in this case, not Chandi. So in this huge work, there are 2 hymns forming the 6th and 47th cantos or chapters. And it's the second of these, the 47th chapter, in 177 verses, that is the object of the source of this information I'm about to give you. This is a hymn to the goddess Chandi on the eve of her final destruction and liberating of the Titan Andaka. And the poet has adopted a very interesting approach, which is to adore the goddess in a number of different ways, some of them quite familiar, a reference to her mythological exploits, quite a lot of that, description of her gruesome temple in the Vindhya mountains and so forth, in which actually he relies upon an earlier Prakrit Kavya, the Gaudavahu of Vagpati. But in addition to the Pauranika references, we have a lot of esoteric material in which the motif is that the goddess is praised as the absolutes of all the current metaphysical systems or soteriological systems current in the Kashmir of that period. So we get a fascinating tour of current soteriologies in Kashmir at that time. And there's clearly an attempt on his part to be comprehensive. The only system which you would see the almost complete lack of is Jainism. And there are plenty of other reasons, there's plenty of other evidence to support the conclusion that Jainism was absent or just marginal in Kashmir. It never really took root in Kashmir. There's a certain amount of satire of Jains, but the Jains are really set up for that purpose. They're accused of being dirty, and because they don't wash. They're really asking for it. So there's a certain amount of satire. For example, in the Agama Dambara of Jayanta Bhatta, the Kashmirian work, where there's a nice scene in the drama in which a clearly corrupt Muni is chasing a female ascetic. The usual sort of standard substance or matter or subject matter of satire. But otherwise, all the other systems are being covered. Brahmanical and Buddhist, particularly the Buddhist systems, are given very generous and insightful treatment. It's clear that a learned Kashmirian at that time did not have a mere superficial book knowledge of the Buddhist traditions. They were thoroughly educated in them. We're looking at a culture at this time in which Brahmanism and Buddhism are essentially on equal terms, and in fact Brahmanical kings, although presenting themselves as essentially Brahmanical, principally Brahmanical, offered very generous patronage of Buddhism. Now in the Brahmanical camp we find a certain amount of Śākta material, and when we look at the detail of that Śākta material, I see the Trika in a very specific way. Not simply, oh well, here the goddess is being identified as the innate power of a non-dual reality, so it must be the Trika. No, that doesn't follow. We see here in the verses that you have in front of you, on item 1, a series of verses, 4 out of 6 that I found in this work, which seem to me to be clear evidence of not merely awareness of the Trika, but of a detailed knowledge of its esoteric subject matter. And I would go further and say that it reveals not merely that the author was aware of these matters, that he happened to be an initiate perhaps in the Trika. It I think is the basis for inference that his audience likewise was thoroughly acquainted with these details. Because if there's one thing guaranteed to make your poetry fall flat on its face, is an audience which has no idea what you're talking about. And generally speaking, it's a principle in Alankara Shastra that you get your facts right, and you don't invent religious systems that don't exist or distort them by getting the details wrong. You do your research before embedding this stuff in poetry. It's often been the case in Indology that authors have, when encountering evidence in literary works that doesn't fit their preconception about sects, particular religious traditions, say, oh well, this person is writing out of hatred of Vaishnavism or hatred of Shaivism or whatever. They don't know what they're talking about. In my experience, generally, authors who do venture to attack other systems do know what they're talking about. They may put an odd spin on it from time to time, a prejudiced view, but nonetheless they get their facts right. And this is true in Kavya as well. A work like the Malti Madhava, the drama Malti Madhava, seems to me to have a very intimate understanding of Karpalika practice, and assumes in the audience they're going to pick up these detailed references. So I think we can see from such materials that there really was, in the audience of such literature, a considerable acquaintance, a substantial acquaintance with these esoteric traditions. Now, just briefly on the date of this material, just so we can see how much earlier it is. Unfortunately, our Kashmirian historian Kalana, in his Rajatarangani, has no proper dates, no really reliable dates, until late in the 9th century, with the death of King Avantivarman. That's the first time he gives a precise date with day, month, and year. Previously, the chronology is rather vague, but he does introduce an exact year for the first time in his history, in 1813, which he says is the day on which the king ruling at the time of the Haravijaya was killed by his uncles. This is a young boy king who ruled nominally for 12 years. He was called Chipata Jayapida, Jayapida the snub-nosed. For some reason he had this derogatory epithet attached to him. So snub-nosed Jayapida ruled for 12 years before being killed by his uncles, who were afraid that once he became an adult he would turn on them because they'd been exploiting him ruthlessly for 12 years. So they decided the best thing to do would be to get rid of him. And he gives us the year. in the Laukika era, saying that it's the 89th year. Now, Laukika era dates are a nightmare because they always leave out the first two digits. It's like when I was in the last century, when I was born in 48. Of course, 1948, but you leave out the first two. So but we can tell from other synchronicities that the year, in fact, is 3889, which is 813 to 814. Now, we know from other evidence that this is slightly inaccurate. We need to evidence in the Tang Shu, the official annals of the Tang dynasty, recording various diplomatic contacts. We know from this, and also from a couple of other synchronicities, that probably we should add 25 years or thereabout to these dates. He's got it slightly wrong. So this tells us that he was murdered and ruled, rather he ruled and was murdered, ruled from 826 and was murdered in 838. So this young king, who was the patron of our poet, ruled during those years. Now the verses themselves. Jyotirmayim akaranendriya vrittim adya hangsakshara stiti mayim visritam ritaugham shrikanta mukhya guru shodasha vira murtim utpulla shakti kamalasanatam upetam. Understand all this as qualifying Chandim. In the accusative, the god is Chandi. Shakti Traya Pratita Shulakaram Shivaya Dhamna Jaganti Sakalanya Vabhasa Yantim Kalola Sankula Paramrita Sampadam Tvam Jayanti Bhairavatanum Kila Kauli Kasta. Very elegantly smoothly composed. I think he's a great poet. He's underestimated by historians of poetry, and there's a reason for that. The work is just so intimidating. It's so huge. To get your mind around it is really a bit of a challenge. And we're lucky it survived into the present. Very few manuscripts survive of the work. There's a reason for that too. So we have to take those two words as those two verses as a kulaka, as a combination of two verses. Kila agame, kila prasiddho. Kila expresses common knowledge. We all know that. It is commonly known, or the scriptures reveal to us. You can have both of those meetings. According to tradition, according to common knowledge, kila. Kaulika sta, those whose faith or conviction is in the kaulikam, that means the revelation of the kula, this kaula system, the Śākta system, at the heart of the later Trika that I've been talking about. Jayanti tvam, they meditate upon you. Tvam jayanti, as Bhairavatanum, in your Bhairava aspect, like having a Bhairava body. That's to say, as Bhairavi. They meditate upon you as Bhairavi. Tanu often has the sense of Atma rather than Shariram. Jyotirmayim, you who embody pure light, pure radiance, Jyotirmayim. They meditate upon you as radiance, the pure radiance of consciousness, in other words. Jyotirmaya. Akaranendriya vritti. Free, literally, not having the vritti, free of the activity of the karana and indriya, transcending the operation of the mind. This is what karana means here. It stands for antakarana, the internal organ, the mind, and the sense faculties, indriya. So they meditate upon you as the pure light that transcends the operations of the mind and the senses, pure light of consciousness. Adyahang sakshara stiti mayim, embodying mayim, the presence, stiti, of the hamsa. Now we go into esoterica, the hamsa sound or phoneme, and that is H. Ha. I shouldn't say H, but you know what I mean, ha. It's the syllable ha, or if you like, the constant unpronounceable, because I didn't give you a vowel. Visritamritaugam, from whom or from whom a flood of nectar flows forth. Visritamritaugam. And the nectar is a code word in the mantra shastra of this tradition for the letter S. Nectar, the nectar sound. Amrita bija is S. So we now have H and S. H, S. Śrikanta Mukhya Guru Shodasha Vira Murtim, who embodies the hero, Vira. Vira is a term for Rudras in this Śākta literature, who is the 16th of the Gurus, of whom the first, Mukhya, is Śrikanta. Now, this is very obscure stuff. If you don't know, if you're not familiar with the Trika, this is really obscure and indeed meaningless to one, you know. So you need to know that the 16 Rudras, beginning with Śrikanta, are the Rudras who personify the 16 vowels, from A through to Visarga. That makes 16. Because we have Ang Ah as the 15th and 16th in this conventional analysis of the alphabet. So that gives us the final sound. It gives us the sound Visarga. Utpula Shakti Kamalasanatam Upetam. Literally, who has gone to Upetam, who has become. You know how in Sanskrit you can say has gone to Xness, meaning has become X. Panchatvam Gataha. He has gone to fiveness. He's only five, the five elements. The soul has left. So here, he has gone to Kamalasana being she has gone to being the lotus throne, Kamalasana Tam, Upetam. She has has as her, sorry, it's a Bahuvri, has gone to the state of having as her lotus throne, Kamalasana Tam, Utpula Shakti. Shakti expanded to its fullest, Utpula. This is a metaphor from flowers which open. So a fully open flower is Utpula or Protpula. So here Shakti is at its greatest extent. And what is that? Au. The last of the vowels before Angana is identified in the Trika system as the nature of Au, the letter Au in the unfolding of the alphabet. So what do we have now? We have H, S, Au. We have a bija, Hsau. Well, I'll come back to that because this takes us into the Trika. Shakti Traya Pratita Shula Karam Shivaya, who has in her hand, Karam, the trident, Shula, Pratita, manifested Shakti Traya by the three Shaktis, Para, Pranapara, or Icha, Jnana and Kriya, to revert to information we've had earlier in these lectures. Dhamna Jaganti Sakalanya Vabhasayantim, causing to appear, understand in consciousness, Avabhasayantim, causing to appear all the worlds. Jaganti Sakalani, you can say the universe, causing the universe to appear in consciousness, Dhamna, through her radiance, Dhamna. So the radiance of consciousness is the appearance of the world in consciousness. So you can see that not only is this author familiar with details of the Trika, he also already seems to have the rasa of the Trika as we find it in the works of Abhinavagupta. Don't you feel the same rasa there? The same sentiment somehow? Who causes to appear all worlds through her own radiance, and so forth. Kalola Sanquila Paramrita Sampadam Tvami, you who are the, or possess the wealth, the abundance of the highest nectar, Paramrita, seething with its waves, sort of turbulent waves. Kalola Sankula Paramrita Sampadam Tvam. Now, this is a feature of the goddess Para, that she is visualized as, in meditation, as pouring forth floods of nectar which fill the body. And this can be used for mundane purposes, either with the idea of bringing about greater understanding, knowledge, or in eloquence, for example, or to remove illness. Floods of nectar, milk-like nectar, pouring into one's body, as opposed to counter imminent death, disease, and so forth. So let me read my translation at this point, up to as far as we've got. It is well known that, Kila, those who zealously enact the Kaula teachings, Kaulikasta, meditate on you, Jantitvam, in your Bhairava aspect, Bhairavatanum, as pure light, Jyotirmayim, beyond the reach of the mind and senses, Akaranendriya Vrittim, one with the state, Stitimayim, of the initial Adya Hamsakshara letter, the Hamsa letter, that's H. Emitting a stream of nectar, or we might say a flood of nectar, the Visritamritaugham, embodying the 16th hero among the teachers led by Sri Kanta Mukhya Guru Shodasha Vira Murtim, enthroned on the open lotus seat of your fully expanded powers. Holding the trident, Trishulakaram or Shulakaram, manifested, Pratita, by the three Shaktis, Shaktitraya, illuminating Shivaya Avabhasayantim. I forgot to translate Shivaya the first time through. Illuminating for liberation. The term Shivam is used here not to refer to Shiva, but for the ultimate good. That expression much beloved in Victorian translation, English translations, Summum Bonum, Shivaya. Illuminating for a liberation all the worlds with your radiance. Now what is he getting at there? The idea here is that liberation is not fully established by seeing some inner point of transcendence or absolute potential. It has to be realized as pervading everything as well. It shouldn't be possible to fall from that state by, as it were, moving out of a point of inner concentration. Then you come down into the world, back to square one. It's still tables and chairs, so to speak. You need to be able to see the content of consciousness from the Trika point of view as irradiated by that inner point, as appearing in consciousness through the radiance of that inner point. So that inner point pervades the manifested universe. This is sometimes expressed as the difference between the fourth state and the state beyond the fourth. In the series Waking, Dreaming, Dreamless Sleep, that's the third. The fourth is just called the fourth. And that is a blissful state which can be realized in the gap between those other three states, as you pass from waking into dreaming, or dreaming into deep sleep, and in the reverse direction. But that's a kind of momentary point of full consciousness which is touched in the transition point between two states, and normally not noticed. The fifth state, the one is Turyatitam, transcending that fourth, is the same state, that same fourth state, made to spread like oil into the other three. Trishu Tailavad Asecham. It must be made to spread like oil into the three. And when it does, so that all you ever experience, and whatever the experience is, however banal, is the blissful resonance of consciousness, then you're enlightened. Hello. So that's, I think, what he's alluding to here. So he seems to be fully in tune with dynamic non-dualism as well. He's not still hovering about wondering whether he wants to have illusionism or real transformation. He's already got the idea of abhasavada. Sakalani jaganti avabhasayantim. Now, moving on, maybe I can touch on a few of these points, but no, it'll take too long. I'll move on. So 98. Let's go back to the text. Pratyanga sangata patanga karabi bhavi koti trayonata vishankata tigma heti sukshma sanatana tanushcha nanutvameva maya kalasu shakali karanaika hetu. So, surely, Nanu, it is you alone, transcending the reach of the faculties. That's my translation of sukshma, literally subtle. It means non-objectifiable. This case is objectifiable. It can be the object of my perception. But she cannot be the object of my perception. She is the substance of my perception. She projects it. She is the agent of it. She's the content of it. She can't be brought into the field of the object. So subtle in that sense, transcending the reach of the faculties and mind, as in akaranendriya vrittim. Sanatana tanu, having a nature, a tanu that is eternal, sanatana tanu, who are able to shatter the powers of maya. What was it? Maya shakti shakali karanaika hetu, was it? I have to go back to the text. Yes, that's a rather loose translation. Who alone is the cause, who is the sole cause, eka hetu, of shattering, literally breaking into fragments, dynamiting, as it were, the constituents, kalasu, the elements of maya. And maya is the whole of the projected universe which appears to us as outside consciousness, differentiated from us and from its individual constituents. So maya is defined in later Pratyabhijñā terms, in accordance with this spirit, I think, as bhinna vedya prata, the appearing in consciousness of differentiated objects, bhinna vedya prata, objects of perception, objects of awareness. The mighty flames that soar up from the three blade tips of your trident, dimming the rays of the sun, i.e. being so brilliant that the rays of the sun seem dull, dim, and permeating every limb. Pratyanga sangata patanga, how did it go? All this assonance is confusing me. Pratyanga sangata patanga kara abhibhavi, literally defeating abhibhavi, the kara, the rays, more brilliant than, defeating the rays of the patanga, the sun, and pratyanga sangata, pervading, in contact with the minutest parts of the body. So there's no part of the body. Pratyanga means subordinate part of the body. So you have your main limbs, head, arms, etc., and then pratyanga are the lesser parts. So by saying pratyanga, he means the whole body. So pratyanga sangata, patanga karabi bhavi, koti trayonata vishankata tigma heti. It would be helpful if I put a few more brackets in the translation, wouldn't it? The mighty flames that soar up from the three blade tips of your trident, dimming the rays of the sun and permeating every limb. Now the next verse, 99. Chakrashrita trishika koti gataravinda satkarnikasana gatam ihakaulikastvam jatvaiti shakti patitam stirabhairavanka vritim parapara vibedavatim janoyam. Janoyam, we, because actually the speakers are plural. They are the siddhasadhyas. They're the audience of this hymn. They are rather uttering this hymn to the goddess. And Janoyam is an interesting idiom in Sanskrit. It means I, aham, or if you like, we, if it's plural in the context. But it suggests an apologetic withdrawal, your humble servant, so to speak. Janoyam. Like, I believe, the expression son of God in Aramaic, a subject on which many volumes of theology have been produced, actually is an Aramaic idiom of polite self-reference. I, a mere son of man. So likewise, Janoyam, this person here, is a modest way of self-reference. So, we Kaulas, Kaulikas, Janoyam. These Kaulas. So the audience are declaring themselves to be Kaulas. The Siddhasadhyas are revealing themselves to be initiates in the Kaula tradition, which is a somewhat interesting observation. We Kaulas, your devotees, as it were, Yeah, I've written it like this in my translation. Here we Kaulas, your humble devotees, Kaulikaha Janoyam, achieve the state of lordship of the wheel of powers, Shaktipatitam. Eti Shaktipatitam, go to the state of being Shaktipati, the Lord of powers. So this is the expression we find in the Shiva Sutras, Chakreshwara, being the Lord of the circle of powers. So we become the Lord of powers. We enter into that state of being the Shaktipati, Sthira Bhairavanka Vrittim, whose mode of operation, whose vritti, whose dynamism, rests in the heart of stable Bhairava, Sthira Bhairavanka, literally in the lap, but it means obviously not the physical lap, but the heart, the core of Bhairava, unchanging Bhairava. So Bhairava is a kind of unchanging substrate, the screen on which the show of Shakti appears. Chandi's nature is manifested. So having meditated on you, they achieved this state of Shakti Patita, which is in the very heart of the stable reality of Bhairava. Parapara Vibedavatim, this mode of operation, this dynamism, which has a distinction, which contains the distinction between the transcendent and the immanent. Parapara Vibedavatim. So it's not purely a transcendent inner higher reality, it also has a higher manifestation than the higher, which is its presence in the manifest universe. So from this Śaiva point of view, the Śākta Śaiva point of view, one rises from above to below. One ascends, as it were, from a state of inner self-realization to a greater state of self-realization in the ordinary movement of the senses and the mind. So this state of Shaktipatita is one that is not diluted by coming out of samadhi, so to speak. You don't think, okay, well that was over now, I'll meditate again in a couple of hours' time and again taste that bliss of immersion in my inner nature. No, you have to take that inner nature and experience it in everyday experience. That's what distinguishes this rather aesthetically oriented notion of liberated consciousness. Now, what is the practice? What is to be meditated upon? That's stated in the first half of the verse. I sound like a school teacher, excuse me. Chakrashita Trishika Koti Gataravinda Satkarnikasana Gatam Tvam. Having meditated upon you, Gatam, located on, just on, Gatam, the throne, asana, the seat, which is the beautiful pericarp or seed pod, Satkarnika, of the lotuses, Aravinda, which are upon Gati, the Trishika Koti, the tips of the trident, Trishika Koti Gataravinda Satkarnikasana Gatam, in your mandala, Chakrashita. Chakra here means mandala. So you remember from earlier lecture, I showed you a picture of the Trika mandala, which features a trident at the center, with lotuses on each of the three tips of those tridents, and the goddess installed in her aspects as para, 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 and apara on those three, with the higher notion that para has two aspects, as it were, one as one of the three, and another as the source of the three. A higher para, para, vibedavati, if you like, again. And in that higher nature, she is known as Matrisadbhava, the essence of all knowers, and also as Kala Sankarshni, the obliterator of time, which is the more Krama-oriented name. So here we see again a clear reference to the mandala of the Trika, the most common mandala of the Trika, the trident, the Trishulabja mandala, the mandala of the trident and the lotuses. One trident, three lotuses, or four in the case of the variant of the Devya Yamala, the Krama-inflected variant. So I think I've shown you enough to indicate that the author was fully conversant with the esoteric particulars of this tradition already in this early period, in the early 9th century, and also that his audience must presumably have been sufficiently clued in not to be utterly lost by these unintelligible details. Now, can we go further and say something about the particulars of this Trika tradition? Because, it's always there's a terrible tendency in Indology to avoid differentiation. Perhaps everyone's influenced by Advaita Vedanta in some way. They want to make everything the same. So, okay, we made a distinction now between Krama and Trika. That's enough, isn't it? Do we have to go into further subdivisions? Can't we just leave it there? No, we should go into further subdivisions. What happens when a system is referred to as given a name is that various slightly discrepant systems are, as it were, gathered in together and labelled under a collective term. So when we look inside this bag, which is the Trika, we see quite distinct traditions. Last week we saw a very distinct form of the Trika as taught in the Tantra Sadbhava Tantra, where meditation is focused upon Bhairava and the goddess in Ardhanarishvara form, as a single body, half female, half male. No trace of that in Abhinavagupta's Trika. I pointed this out last time. We've also seen, in the course of these lectures, a differentiation between a form of the Trika found in the Malini Vijayottara, which is the root of the Tantrāloka, which venerates the 3 goddesses on the trident, and a form taught in the Devya Yamala, a lost Tantra with a strong Krama orientation, which teaches a transcendent 4th goddess, Kala Samkarshini. We had 2 traditions there already. Now we have a 3rd, that of the Trishiro Bhairava. The Trishiro Bhairava. I'll just put up the name. The Tantra of the 3-headed Bhairava. Now, there's a tradition in Kashmir, which was alive at least into the 13th century, that the scriptures of the Trika are divided into 3 main works. There are 3 core scriptures. The first is the Siddhiyogeshwari Mata, of which we have a small recension surviving in Nepal, which is ritualistic. It really is concerned with sadhana and cremation grounds to produce supernatural effects for the most part. It's not really oriented to liberation strongly, I would say. Then we have the Trishiro Bhairava. It's mentioned as one of the 3 cardinal scriptures. And the Trishiro Bhairava, which does not survive, at least no manuscript has come to light, is said by Jayarata to be Jnana Pradhanam, to be a Gnostic text, as opposed to ritualistic text. And this ritualism, this non-ritualism, this Gnosticism, this knowledge orientation is borne out by the many citations that we have in Jayarata's commentary on Tantrāloka and in Abhinavagupta's references to the text in Tantrāloka itself. It's extremely obscure, extremely esoteric, talking about things we can't see, often to do with esoteric meditation on centers in the body, using a very obscure terminology which we just don't fully understand. And I suspect Abhinavagupta didn't either. This is the problem with the scriptural tradition. Knowledge comes and goes. It's a vast, diverse corpus. Even a brain like Abhinavagupta's was unable to access full information about everything somehow within his purview. So what does he do in those cases? Well, he doesn't say, na janami. It's not part of the convention of omniscience to admit you don't know. So you say, no, ati rahasyatvad idam na vyakyayam. I mustn't explain this because it's too secret. Sometimes there are empty boxes. The rahasya can mean indeed something which you don't want to talk about publicly. Your private life, for example, is something rahasyam in a sense. It exists, but is secret in a way. And so also in esoteric matters, there can be practices which you don't want to talk about openly for fear of being misunderstood. But sometimes the word rahasya really, I think, just covers a gap in information. And this is very much true with comments about the Trishiro Bhairava. Now, why am I mentioning the Trishiro Bhairava here in association with these verses? Well, because the syllable chesau that we saw subtly raised in that verse, letter by letter, is a form of the seed syllable of the goddess Para, as taught in the Trishra and nowhere else. Well, I can put it perhaps more accurately by saying, in the Malnivijyottara, the Siddhyogeshwari Mata, and the Tantra Sadbhava, the syllable of the goddess is Sau. In the Trishra we have a different tradition, Hasau or Sahau. The first two can be either way round. And I've seen no evidence of its, in the literature of it, having this form except in the Trishra Bhairava. So it looks as if we have the Trishra Bhairava ruling the roost in Kashmir in this early period, rather than the tradition of the Malnivijyottara or the Siddhyogeshwari Mata. I think on your handout you'll have a fair amount of material to back that up. I threw this together rather quickly, and without weeding out quite a few of the footnotes, which as you can see are rather detailed. My idea is to try to explain everything, but not to overburden the reader who doesn't want to look into the minute details. But if they have their doubts, they can read the footnotes and see what evidence I think supports my interpretation. So, for example, on Janoyam, there's a long section there citing various Alankara Shastra works and so forth, Kavya works. But if you look at your item 2 on page 4 of the handout, you will see a citation from the Tantrāloka, the 30th book of Tantrāloka, which deals with the mantras of the Trika, on Hasau. And I'm saying that this is a signature of the trick of the Trishra Bhairava. Saneka Bheda Trishira Shastre Prokta Maheshina Sarupito Vibhinapi Rachananeka Sankula Jiva Pranasta Evatra Pranova Jiva Samstita. Para, that's Sa, has been taught by Maheshwara in the Trishra Bhairava to have more than one form or type. Although undifferentiated in her essence, Swarupataha Avibhinnapi, she is replete with diverse forms. Among these, the living soul may rest on the vital breath. Living soul is code for Sa, the letter Sa, and the vital breath is code for Ha, or the vital breath on the soul. So it can be Hasa or Sa, not Sh, by the way. Perhaps I should put a hyphen there to remove that confusion. And Jairata in the item 3 that follows on page 5 explains this. Taduktam Tatra, that matter has been taught in that text, the Trishra Bhairava, as follows. Parashaktis tu savitriya ichayacha niyojita jiva pranasta evatra pranovai jiva samstita. Iti tena hasau veti. That's Jairata's commentary. So that has been taught in that scripture as follows. Here the Shakti Para is the living soul, S, on the vital breath, H, or vice versa. Conjoined with Savitri, that's code for Au, and the precognitive impulse, that's Visarga. So it is Hasau, it is Sahau or Hasau. Now, interestingly, Hasau is also the form of Para's seed syllable that has reached us in the ritual manuals of the Śaiva officiants of Kashmir, these largely anonymous materials, but not entirely anonymous. So you'd have expected, on the basis of Tantrāloka, Malnivijyottara, Siddhyogeshwari Mata, and Tantra Sadbhava, that if the syllable of Para were to be found in the ritual manuals, it would be Sau. In fact, we find Hasau. And I've given you there an unnecessarily long selection, but it's a section of the work called the Kala Diksha Padati, their standard manual for the performance of Śaiva initiation, a very elaborate ritual which lasts 6 days. A work composed in the 14th century, but extended greatly in the time of Akbar, by an author called Rajanaka Shivaswami. And there he inserts in the ritual, although the ritual is based upon Swachanda Bhairava rather than the Trika, he inserts a section which is presumably designed for initiates in the Trika, or who have a family connection with the Trika. So the mantras of the Trika must also be gratified in the fire sacrifice. And he sets out all the mantras there. And in line 4, you will see Om Hasau Parayai Namaha Iti Sampuja, etc. Om Hasau Parayai Swaha. First offerings, ordinary puja offerings, and then offerings into the fire. So Nama in the first case, Swaha in the second. And you see that it's the syllable Hasau which is used there, not Sau. Now, why is this mumbo jumbo of interest? you may ask. Well, I think from the point of view of intellectual history or cultural history, what's interesting there is that we see a connection between something found in the early 9th century and something that is to be found in the anonymous, you might say almost unconscious corpus of ritual practice maintained by the Shaiva priests who served the tantric families in Kashmir. And that rather alerts us to the possibility that this may be a continuous tradition which has been concealed from view by the success of one or two important works, notably the Tantrāloka. So we shouldn't assume, it warns us against assuming that the most important text, the one that seemed to us to tell us most about tradition, are the ones that are most representative of the historical reality of that tradition. This suggests perhaps that the substrate tradition was Trishul Bhairava, and Abhinavagupta's learned exegesis of the Malini Vidyotra is slightly out of tune with that ongoing substrate. That's the point I want to make. Now, before finishing, there are 2 more verses. So let me just look through this handout a bit further. You've got the evidence on Hasau. Oh, there's some stuff there, item 5 on 6, about the trident in the hand of the goddess. There's some material also on the, on this fact. In item 5, you see the goddess embodied in Hasau is depicted in the second of Ratnakara's stanzas as holding a trident. This we know to be a feature of the iconography of the Trika's alphabet goddess Malini. I won't read all of that, you can check it out in your own time. So she is visualized carrying a skull bowl in one hand and a trident in the other, which is not something we see with Para. So it looks as though we have to ask ourselves, is Ratnakara's goddess Malini rather than Para? The correct answer to this question, I think, is that she is Malini, which is the alphabet goddess in the strange order beginning with Na and ending with Pa rather than A ending with Ksha. But rather, she is Malini in the form of Para. The 2 deities are somehow merged here for the purpose of devotion. So here too, the anonymous ritual manuals of the Kashmirian Śaiva officiants assist our comprehension. For when these officiants made offerings to the goddess of the Purvamnaya, I introduced that category in an earlier lecture. This is the Kaula Trika. So when these officiants made offerings to Para as the goddess of the Purvamnaya, in the comprehensive fire sacrifice detailed in their Agni Karya Padati, they identified her as Malini, but recited a verse that addresses her as Para and encodes her sonic form as the seed syllable of that goddess. So she's worshipped as Malini, but with the syllable Sau. And it's a rather elegant verse. I think I read it before in an earlier lecture. Atmendu dhamani yogesha naresha putra chitram trishula biladamani shishti shaktim vaisargiketa chiti dhamani pundarikam kanchit param trikaparam pranamami shaktim. So sometimes these works produced by the priests contain some quite elegant writing. It's not all, the general view of Indian priests is that they are at the low order of scholarship, etc. But occasionally something better comes through here. I bow before the goddess Para, the inexpressible white Shakti beyond the triad, adorned by the presence in her retinue of the lords of the ages and the princes, that's the Kaula tradition, who emits her power first in the moon center that is the self, that's S, then in the fontanelle, that is the trident, that's Au, and then in the ground of consciousness, whose nature is emission. So this interpretation has further support from the fact that this merging of the identities of Malini and Para, or rather of Para's identity into Malini's, the merging of Para into Malini, is carried forward into the Paschimamnaya, and this fact is further evidence in support of that development. For in the Srimatottara of that tradition, Malini's seed syllable is Husraum, which is evidently another variant of Para's. More specifically, a variant which I haven't mentioned before, which is also taught in the Trisha or Bhairava, which is so this is the Trisha or Bhairava's form, third form. Sahasa au, which is really a prolated au, just draws it out further. So in the Srimatottara of the Paschimamnaya, this is not exactly what we see. What we see is rather Husraum, and I'm simply saying this is clearly a variant of that one. The Paschimamnaya has to assert its individuality as far as possible. It's taking over Trika material, but spinning it slightly so it's not identical. It's inventive, you might say. Yeah. There's more evidence to that effect you can read from the Kularatna Dyota. Now, finally, this last verse I want to mention. Missing out quite a lot of material. Two further verses in the Haravijja which show an intimate knowledge of the Trika. It says an intimate knowledge in your handout. That's meant to be intimate, not intimate or animate. Tattvam bhavani narashakti shivatmakam yat etatridastitamursanti paravaragya rudranu mandalamalam samabubudastvam adya mati sam anuvartita karane cha. You, Bhavani, you, O goddess, are this triad of Nara, Shakti and Shiva that the all-knowing proclaim. The all-knowing are the followers of the Trika. You, Bhavani, are this triad of Nara, Shakti and Shiva that the all-knowing proclaim. It is you, the primal consciousness, Adya Matihi, that, enacting the will of the first cause, have awakened the multitude of Rudra souls, or Rudras and souls. That concludes us, it seems. Yeah. Now, the point here is that Nara, Shakti and Shiva is a distinct signature of the Trika. And you have there on your handout, on pages 8 and 9, a series of evidences to this effect, where authors explicitly state that this is the signature doctrine of the Trika. That is, that one reality manifests itself in these three modalities. Individual consciousness, Nara, literally man, Shakti, power, and Shiva. And the important thing is that these are one reality with three modalities. This is one reality with three modalities, not three realities or three categories of entities which are eternally distinct from each other. One reality has three forms of operation as Nara, Shakti and Shiva. And this is declared throughout our literature as a doctrine distinctive of the Trika. But I'd just like to draw your attention to passage E on page 9, which is a quotation from a South Indian work, the Trishika Tatparya Deepika, horribly transmitted and fascinating. It's a very frustrating text. You can see that it's saying very interesting things. Occasionally it gets into focus. It's like a bad microfilm. Occasionally the text improves and you can read it and then it fades again and you can't. That's my experience of this text. But it's a commentary on Abhinavagupta's commentary. It's a commentary on a South Indian commentary on the Trishika, otherwise known as the Paratrimshika. And referring to the doctrine taught by Shiva in the scriptures of the Trika, other than this Anuttara system taught in the Trishika, it says, Trikam prakashayamasa nara shakti shivatmakam. Shiva has revealed through these scriptures the triad of Nara, Shakti and Shiva. And then it goes on in a slightly later passage, just quite close to it in fact, 5 verses on, to indicate that what's specific about the Trishika is that it transforms this trikad into a higher form as the object, means and agent of cognition. So what that passage is doing is saying, the normal understanding of the Trika is, why is it called the Trika, the triad? Because it teaches this triad of the individual soul called Nara, Shakti and Shiva. But later, in this Trishika text, we have a higher revelation. Perhaps we shouldn't use the word later, because it indicates history, but we have a higher revelation in the Trishika, in which this basic triad is reinterpreted in terms of the object, means and agent of cognition. And that's the Copernican revolution I referred to earlier, which is initiated by Utpala, I think, rather than the Trishika. There's no trace of that in the Trishika proper. What he's talking about is Utpala's reading of the Trika here. So that's rather interesting, because it's not often that we have him, we can see in our texts an almost clear admission of a change of gear in the tradition from an earlier phase to a later phase. But we do see this in our Shaiva non-dualism of Kashmir. We saw it, for example, in Utpaladeva's attitude to Somananda, saying it had introduced a tradition which was not new, it's already there in the scriptures, but it was latent, it hadn't been brought out, and now Utpaladeva and Somananda have brought it to the fore, and we can all now see clearly what the Kaula scriptures are really teaching us to do, which is to have direct insight into the dynamism of our cognition. A point of view strongly influenced by the Krama, of course. So you see why I think it's important to distinguish these traditions and not just talk about Kashmir Shaivism. It's a kind of soup in which everything is mixed up so that no differences matter. The commentators are doing just that. They're trying to make it all seem like one single systematic doctrine. But to see what they're up to, you have to see what they're mixing. The cultural significance is in the mixing. What's going into the mix? You need to be able to distinguish Krama elements from Trika elements, different elements of the Trika in the mix as well, which is one of the things I'm trying to do. So that's the first verse. The second verse, which is your item 11 on page 9, I believe, yes, is from the same chapter of the Haravijaya. Sarva prapancha parivarjita nirvikara shantati vritta paratattva shivatma vritti sukshmati sukshma gahana prakriti shikheti saushupta mandalagata paridipya setvam. It is you that flare up, paridipya setvam, as shika, shiketi, the flame, in the center of the circle of dreamless sleep. Saushupta mandalagata, in the circle of dreamless sleep. One with Shiva, Shivatma Vritti, flowing in oneness with Shiva, Shivatma Vritti, who as the highest stratum of reality, the Paratattva, is free of all multiplicity, changeless, transcending even Shanta, Shantati Vritta. Shanta is the highest segment of the manifest universe in the categorization of all of the Shaivas, not just the Śākta Śaivas. Now, the proof that that is based upon a reading of the Trishara Bhairava, at least the probability that it is found on page 10, where I give you a citation from Tantrāloka 6, in which I'll just read the translation. This vast hierarchy of manifestation in its two modalities as processes and entities is grounded in its entirety in the vital energy, prane. For what we mean by vital energy is much more than respiration and the other physiological processes of life. It is what has been termed shika, the flame in the Trishara Bhairava. This flame manifests itself externally as respiration, But when that has been bound up, baddha, at such times as that of worship, it ceases to oscillate like the ordinary breath, and as a result becomes manifest in its inner nature as the power of consciousness that is Shiva himself. Shivatmika, it becomes Shivatmika. Yeah. And I just quote there a passage from the Viveka on the Tantrāloka. Jayarata's comment on this passage, these two verses I've just read out. Quoting Shishra Bhairava, a passage in which the term Shika is indeed identified as the power of Shiva, or rather of Bhairava, since that's the relevant name for Shiva in this context. Quote, Shika parimita shaktir Bhairavasya tukatyate kriya shaktir iti kyata. What we call Shika is the unlimited power of Bhairava. It is this that we are referring to when we speak of Bhairava's power of action. Actually, in the edition, it's understood as Shika paramita. The two words are separated. Shika paramita, which is nonsense. That would be, what we call Shika is the limited power of Bhairava. No, we don't want his power to be limited. The idea is here that what appears to be a power limited in the form of the prana, the vital energies, is really an unlimited power. It can be transformed from that into an unlimited power through being fixed at the time of worship and meditation, at which time trance takes over, the breath dissolves, Shiva consciousness awakens. And that's the Shika, the flame that shoots up from within the orb of the state of dreamless sleep, which is the point in which the two breaths are on the point of dissolving. That's seen as the nature of Sushupti. In deep sleep, the breath gets subtler and subtler and subtler, and then you wake with a jerk. Unless you're fortunate, graced by the goddess, in which case you wake up at that point. The Shika surges up, and you attain blissful enlightenment. That seems like an auspicious sentence with which to end, so I'll stop there. Thank you.